Okay, so let's start off. Let's begin. And most of you, I think, are very familiar with Danny Davis. Danny has been on our board now for what, Danny? Over a year.
Almost 2 years now.
It's an almost two now. God, the time has flown. Danny's just come out with a brand new book called 11th Hour, which he's going to talk to us about. For those of you who do not know Danny, I'll just briefly say that he served for 21 years in the Army. And he retired as a lieutenant colonel. He's now a military expert at defense priorities. He was in combat 4 times, twice in Iraq and twice in Afghanistan. In Iraq, he was in the Desert Storm under the command of Doug McGregor, also on our board. And Danny won the Bronze Star for valor in the largest tank battle since World War II in Desert Storm in 1991. And then he redeployed again in the second Iraq War into Bush in 2009. In Afghanistan, he was there twice, 2005 and 2011. In 2012, when he returned for the second time, he got some notoriety when he stood up and said that we weren't, the generals were wrong, that we weren't winning, we were losing. And he won the Rittenhour Prize for truth telling. And so Danny is strongly in the truth telling category. Danny writes articles all the time. You may have read him in the Washington Post, New York Times, many other publications. He's a frequent guest on TV as an expert, almost a fixture like Doug and Fox News. He's been on BBC, CNN, and so let's kick this off, Danny. We have some of your military buddies who joined us tonight, Matt Hoh and Danny Sjursen. We'll get to them. We'll open it up after and let them speak. But why don't you kick it off and tell us why you wrote this book and what you think it means.
Yeah, thanks so much, John. I truly am really grateful to have the opportunity to speak here. I mean, I've been coming to these salons for years now, and have respected all the people who are here so much, and respect and admire this institution for putting these things out there that other people don't talk a lot about, and helping to find solutions. So it's a real treasure and an honor for me to be here tonight. In terms of why I wrote this book, look, I mean, we just got to be honest. American foreign policy is jacked up, and there's just no good way to say it. And that's probably the nicest way that it could be said. If American foreign policy is supposed to be what's going to help the country and what's going to improve our national security, what's going to enhance our ability to prosper as a nation, then by that definition, our foreign policy since at least 9/11 has been a complete disaster, or shortly thereafter, because the threats to our country are probably higher now than they've been, especially from terrorism. They haven't been helped by all these things we've done since 9/11, and the risk to great powers is higher than it has been in a great many years. And all of that, I think, or at least the vast majority of that is based on, or is a product of, our bad foreign policy. So that's the starting point, is that our foreign policy is messed up, but we've got to fix it, and we've got to get it better. Fortunately, there are some things that we can do, even at this late hour. And that's the whole point of the 9/11, or the 11th hour, is because it's late in this year. It was late in the election cycle when the book was first published, but it's also late in this era of American exceptionalism in our American history, because so far nothing bad has happened. As I point out in the book, I mean, we're not at war with China, we're not at war with Russia, we're not at war with Iran, North Korea, any of these other people. All of our armed forces are still as strong as they've been in a long time. And if we can adopt a better foreign policy, one that makes sense and is sane, then there's every reason in the world why we can continue to have a great nation, and to have all of our freedoms domestically and economic opportunity abroad, keep that American dream becoming a reality. But before we secure that, there's some things we're going to have to do. And I guess some of the justification I used to say, yeah, our foreign policy is messed up. I mean, it doesn't really take a rocket science to figure this out. I mean, you look, we're in a whole series of forever wars, and we'll talk about those in some detail here in a few minutes. We've lost our constitutional separation of powers, so that wars are now easy to get into and dreadfully hard to get out of. Diplomacy has been replaced to almost irrelevance now. And, you know, and so the net result of all these things is a new status quo in which people are in power in large measure because these things benefit them. Now, I don't think anybody, you know, sets out to say, hey, I want to have a really bad foreign policy and do things that are going to hurt America, and I'm going to resist anything else. Most of these people, it's been my experience, whether it's people on the Hill, people in the military, they all have the right intention. They all want to do something good for America. But the problem comes in how they do it. And there's a great fear, I'll say, of changing the status quo. People don't want to do anything different. If there is a success, and especially I'll start on the military side, if you want to be a 4-star general, and if you want to retire up at that level, and you have aspirations toward that, then you got to play along. You're not even going to get to be a 1-star general if you don't play along when you're a lieutenant colonel and colonel, et cetera, and all that up there. And we see that all the time. And the problem is that people are right. If you don't play along, you don't get up there. So their institutional pressure to play along, and that means that they keep perpetuating policies that don't work. Because by any objective measure, it shouldn't be hard at all to see when you're talking about the commanders, and I believe there's been 15 or 16 of them in Afghanistan in particular since 9/11, and every single one of them has said, we're doing better. We're trending in the right direction. We've made a lot of progress, et cetera. And yet you look and you say, not only have you not made progress, you've never succeeded at all. And, you know, you have to ask, well, why would these really smart people who've gone up the chain, you know, say stuff that is demonstrably false? And that's because a lot of the institutional pressure in there. And that's one of the things we're going to have to change, is we're going to have to get rid of the status quo. And that's going to mean, as I'll talk about in a little bit of detail later here, we're going to have to elevate some more people to get up into these areas so that they actually have a chance. You know, good people, experienced people, intelligent people, educated people have a chance to start, you know, changing the status quo and doing things that do make sense. As I said a minute ago, I'm still very optimistic that we can do those things. I'm just a little bit pessimistic that we're going to do those things. Some of the other things that I want to point out is that, you know, this is not just my personal opinion, even though it's based on, you know, 2 decades or almost 3 decades of physical experience on the ground in all these combat zones and in other parts of the military, to where I've been able to see this. But the American people can see it too. And we've been seeing that trend quite a bit over the last 5 or 6 years in particular, but slowly, even before that, is that they're not buying all this stuff about, oh yeah, it's working. Just, you know, a little bit more patience, a little bit more time. People are saying, no, you know what? It's time to get out of this. They're not experts in foreign policy. Many of them have never served, so they don't really understand why, but they just inherently know correctly that it's not working, and we need to get out of these forever wars because they don't serve any purpose and they never end and they never succeed. And the veterans see it too, and they're in increasing numbers and even higher percentages increasing in the last few years. And you're going to hear from a couple of them here in a minute. Tremendous people, very heroes of their own right, and highly educated and talented. They see this stuff from the ground, and it's taken a little bit longer for the military community to come to the same conclusion that it's not worth it, because it's kind of in our DNA that we're supposed to take something that's hard and to make it work. And nobody has seen the amount of things that we put into this, the price that we paid over the years, more than the vet community, and nobody wants that to be wasted, you know, any less than the military community does. But we're finally coming to the point, many of us are, to where we say, hey, you know what, I don't want the sacrifices to have been wasted in the past, but I don't want any more pointless sacrifice, so we need to shut this down. It's just not working. So now that you have the American people and you have the military veterans coming to the same conclusion at nearly the same clip, which is about 3/4 of the percentage of the people that they've polled have come to this conclusion. and they can see the obvious that this is right. Now, a lot of the book is included in I go into some detail in some of my combat experience in Desert Storm, then into both the 2005, 2006 Afghanistan, then the 2009 Iraq, and then finally the 2010, 11 Afghanistan, which was real pivotal and what kind of got me into trouble and got me into some of the notoriety, because I had just finally had seen enough by that point. But what the whole stream that you see through there that I tried to detail in every one of these situations, that the leaders were under a lot of pressure to say the right thing and to do what's expected of them, and to not buck the system. And so I saw that, especially starting in 2005 in Afghanistan to some degree, but I saw it to a larger degree in the future combat systems in 2007 and 2008 when I was at Fort Bliss, Texas. Is I saw lots of mendacity by there. And I'm talking at the highest levels at some of the generals. The people who were at my level, like at that time I was a major, and certainly the people down lower on the ranks who were doing these experiments and who were physically going through all these things, we saw that it was just a disaster, that it wasn't working. It simply was not working, despite all the claims to the contrary. But instead of acknowledging reality, and instead of saying, okay, well, this doesn't work, this is dumb, let's stop doing this and let's start doing something else. Let's find something that will work so that we can improve our future combat capability and continue to escalate with our capability technologically so that we maintain an edge over our potential adversaries. But instead of doing that, they clung to the story that this was working, and they ignored all of the evidence and the facts on the ground and all the people like me and others in the program who tried to tell them it wasn't working. And of course, that had its predictable consequence that in 2009, Secretary of Defense Gates said, this ain't working, so we're going to cancel it. And so he did that. So kudos to him for that. But the problem is, and this is something that we also see repeating, no one was held accountable. We don't hold anyone to account. So instead of, I'll just give you one painful example, is that the one-star general who was in charge of the actual FCS program at Fort Bliss, the guy who was in charge throughout his tenure while the FCS program was in its death throes and when it was finally canceled, you would think that he would have been resigned in disgrace, or that at nothing else he'd have been sent off to some post in Alaska where we'd never heard from him. But you'd be wrong. What instead happened was he gets a lot of really high awards. He gets promoted to a 2nd star, given a division command, which is like the absolute epitome and the height of everything that an officer would aspire to. And then he went on to get a corps command after that. And again, just some of the biggest rewards that you can imagine. And you just have to ask, how in the world can that be? How can it be that something that was complete disaster that resulted in now almost 20 years of wasted time, $20 billion, and we're still almost using the same equipment we were in Desert Storm, same equipment that was made in the late 70s and fielded in the early 80s, because that's just how the system works. It rewards people who play by the rules. And so even when they're called out for failure, no one is individually held accountable. Now imagine what that's going to do to other people. They're coming up the ranks. They see guys like me who said something. I'm certainly not the only one. There's been many people that said, I saw them my own self, who said, this is not right, this is not working, let's do this, this is what we're being paid to do something that makes sense, that works. Those people don't get promoted. They get pushed to the side. They sometimes even get in trouble. And then they see this other guy, like this one-star general I mentioned, they see him go all the way up to the pinnacle. Now, what are you going to do the next time you come up to a situation, is these people who've been watching this, and you see that if you go one direction, you're going to get sidelined. And if you go another direction, you may get promoted. There's just a lot of pressure to do the thing that's going to make the most sense. And, and a lot of people will tell themselves, I'm not going to make any difference anyway, so I'm just going to go along. Let them take care of that part. I'm just going to do the best job that I can. And, that becomes institutional. And this is what we have. This is the result of it. And the same thing you can see playing out in Congress all the time. Because there was many people, I know that a number of folks on this list right here that are watching this have talked to many members of Congress, the Senate and the House, and we've talked to a lot of people who see all the same things that we do, But if they speak up, they get sidelined. And if they play along, they get promoted. And, you know, the Walter Jones, a former rep from North Carolina, who was one of the most honorable members of Congress I ever had the privilege of meeting in person before he passed away, he did the right thing. He said, no, this is wrong. I was originally in support of the Iraq war before I realized what had happened, and all the things that we were told turned out to not be told. So I'm now going to acknowledge that, and I'm going to change course. That's what should have happened throughout the entire Congress. Instead, he was one of the few voices that did that. There was a few others, thank goodness. But what was his reward for that? He gets sidelined. He wasn't even, after 20 something years, he wasn't even the chairman of a subcommittee, much less of a major committee. And so he was basically completely made powerless in terms of actually doing anything. Meanwhile, other people who said, you know, the war was a disaster. Oh, well, actually, no, it's not. Now it was good. And oh, well, then it didn't work out after that. Well, yeah, actually, it was bad. They just kind of bounce around with wherever the popular mode is, and they get rewarded. They're chairman of this committee or that committee. They go on up there. Some of them run for office later on, or they get out and then they go on to lucrative jobs in think tanks or in other defense industries for the military. And you see there's a reward for not doing it right. And you can go along that way for a long time. And this is one of the other reasons I wrote this book. You can do that for a while. You can do it for decades, as we've seen right now. But there's going to come a day when you're going to have to pay the piper, when these things aren't going to work, when the mendacity will actually have hardcore consequences that can't be mitigated at that point. And that could come in the form of stumbling into a stupid war, a war we should never fight, a real war where we may actually be harmed. We've actually dodged a few bullets here in the last couple of years, but you got to wonder how much longer that we can dodge those bullets, because some of these bad foreign policies that we continue to enact and to continue to follow build up this bad vibes that are happening, build up this bad blood that a lot of people have. It makes our enemies hate us more. It makes our friends like us less, because they see some of this stuff that we're doing, because they're not blinded by some of these domestic influences that we are here. And so there could come a day when we're going to need some help from our friends, and they're not going to be so ready to give it. Or there's going to come a day when we push, some of our people who maybe were adversaries into outright enemies that didn't really need to fight, didn't want to, but now they finally feel like they're pushed into a corner. Now that they're going to do something. And that's when things could get really south. And I want to cut that stuff off. And so that's why the last part of this book that I wrote was, what we can do instead. And I think the heart of what I really define here is called constructive realism. It's like, look, it's taking the world as it is, not as we want it to be, not as we wish it would be, but recognizing it as it is, the warts, the good, the bad, the neutral, and saying, all right, how can we take all of the stuff that exists and make policies that ensure America's continued national security, that enhance our ability to prosper as a nation, and that protect our freedoms at home. All of those things can still be done if we'll take the world as it is. Now, that means that we don't have permanent enemies. It's like you just can't look and say, okay, Russia's always evil, always bad, always our enemy. North Korea, Iran, always our enemy. Because once you do that, you shut off the possibility of even working with anyone. And then on the other side of that possibility, you've got like Saudi Arabia and maybe even Turkey to some degree, where we're like, okay, they're on our side. So even though they do some things we don't like, we always turn a blind eye to it. And that harms our interests as well. What we have to do is say, okay, we're going to take people and when the circumstances it is, if someone is an adversary, some country may be otherwise against us, we're going to do business with them where we can, where it makes sense for the United States. We're not going to unnecessarily provoke anybody, and we're not just going to turn a blind eye to anything that's on the negative side, whether it's our values or our actual harm to the country. And one of the best things to do with taking, or the best tools to use for recognizing the world as it is that we have to elevate and reform and re-empower, I think, diplomacy. The military instrument was designed and should have been, and at some points in our past has been, as a means of last resort to defend America. Now, if I work for Defense Priorities, as you mentioned at the beginning, and I am an unapologetically pro-strong national defense. I want our country to be as safe as it can be. I don't want us to be at risk of being, any kind of an unprovoked attack from anyone, whether it's a global superpower, nuclear power like Russia or China, or a regional adversary, or a terrorist group. I want us to be safe from all of them. And that is entirely within our power to do, as long as we have these right policies.
Oh.
And so by elevating diplomacy, we make it less likely that we'll have to use the military instrument. And because our military is so strong, we have a very strong deterrent to prevent anyone from doing something untoward towards us. So, any kind of an unprovoked Pearl Harbor type attack, for example, those are things that we can do. But the problem that we have in getting there, as we see all the time, is that too many people are comfortable with Iran being a permanent enemy, with Russia being a permanent enemy. And if you do anything at all that in any way seems to be positive toward one of those countries, or that results in something positive, it's almost reflexively argued against. And there's probably no better example of that than the JCPOA. So President Obama had this deal that he made. It was he didn't do it all the way the right way. If he'd have made it a treaty, it might have had a better shot. But he kind of took some shortcuts for political expediency, but that all came back to ricochet against him, because now it made it easy for Trump to get rid of. But so by saying that, Iran is an enemy, President Trump went in and said, okay, we're going to get rid of the JCPOA. We're going to work a new deal. But of course, nobody is going to work that way. No country, no individual, no company is going to say, okay, you had a deal with me, you got rid of it, and now you want to renegotiate to my weakness and to my harm. Where's my motivation to have any interest with that at all? I mean, if you're going to negotiate, if you're going to have genuine diplomacy, whether it's Iran or Russia or England or the UN, I'm sorry, the EU, anybody, friend or foe, anything else, you have to say, all right, where do we have common ground here? What can we both agree on? This is something I think is good for us. This is something that's good for you. This is what I really want, this thing right here. And so, what do you need for us to have a deal here? Because if you don't even have the possibility of coming out of a negotiation with something you want, then you have no motivation to get into it. You have no motivation to give anything away if you don't get anything in return. But we have such a broken mentality in terms of our foreign policy that we can't do that. We have to win and they have to lose. And it's just not going to work. That's not going to happen. Iran, under whether it's Biden or anybody else that might follow after him, they're not going to renegotiate a deal that's to their further detriment if they don't come out of it with something they want. Now, look, here's what should be self-evident. Just like in any kind of negotiation, if you at least allow the other side to get something that they want, now then they have a lot less motivation to do things you don't like, as is the case with Iran right now. So because we don't even give them the possibility of anything that they want, they're continuously, moving further towards the breakout nuclear capabilities. They're reprocessing more stuff, which trying to keep pressure on us. They're doing other nefarious things. They're shooting down our drones. They're doing other things that we don't like, but that's because of this stupid, maximum pressure, which is a disaster of its own right. But that's inherent in this whole policy, this idea that I have to win and you have to lose. Well, if we want to get rid of that, if we want to change that dynamic, then we've got to allow the other side to come out with some kind of a win. Then the threat of war goes down. The threat of anybody feeling like they have to have a nuclear deterrent goes down, and our insecurity goes up. Our cost to maintain security goes down, and our country continues to be prosperous and free. Now, that is a good foreign policy. Anything that improves your security, costs less to do it, and guarantees your freedom and ability to economically prosper, that should be the default position that we go to. And as I pointed out, and unfortunately, it's not.
Can we open it up now? And
yes, yeah, that's what else.
I think you've done an excellent job of covering that territory. We have two former military veterans, Daniel Sjursen and Matt Hoh, here tonight. Matt, you want to go first. Matt got a lot of notoriety. You were a Marine, right? Not Army.
Yeah, correct.
Danny, both Danny's are Army. And you wrote, you worked, you had. Why don't you just go ahead and describe your background and the memo that you wrote and how you came out against the Afghan war and the Iraq war?
Yeah, I was in the Marine Corps for 10 years. I was in the Iraq War twice. And then in 2009, I was a State Department officer in Afghanistan. And when the war was being escalated, at that point, I resigned and became, in the fall of 2009, as you were saying, John, that letter became public and ended up on the front page of the Washington Post. And I kind of Forrest Gumped myself into a position of prominence in terms of speaking against the war. And that's how I got to know a lot of people, John, yourself, and then a number of other people I've seen on this call, Peter and Bruce and Jody and some other folks who are on this call. It's good to see you all. And thank you, John, for having me on here. I remember going to your events, I guess around 2011, 2012, while I still lived in Washington, D.C., and really always appreciative of everything that you all are doing. Danny's book is so important. It's, if you all haven't read it, it's a short book. It's a quick read. It deals with things from the past, the present. He gets into ideas about the future. It's very personal at times. And what I think it really is and as well as too, as Danny Sjursen's book, his book, Patriotic Descent, it serves as a really great primer for people who may not be familiar with varying ideas or different opinions on foreign policy. The foreign policy machine, the war-making machine in Washington, D.C. is known as the blob. And there's great reason for that, right? It's just like, if you remember that old film from the 1950s and the foreign policy establishment in Washington, D.C., the people that are behind these wars, that image of the blob, is just so perfect. And so if you need something to get to people and say, look, there are other ways to think about this. You just don't have to listen to what the generals and the admirals and the think tank pundits and what CNN and MSNBC and Fox have to say about this, or what they write about it in the editorial pages of the Post or the Times or the Journal. There are other views out there from very well qualified and experienced men and women who have been right all the time, who have been correct in their public pronouncements for years now, for, in Danny's case, a decade now. And, as opposed to what we see continually in Washington, D.C., which, as my friend Robert Wright said the other day, Robert Wright, who has a page called Non-Zero, is giving report cards out to Biden's incoming foreign policy team, and Wright makes the point that there's almost an inverse equation in terms of who gets foreign policy jobs in Washington, D.C. And that's across the board, whether it be Pentagon, State Department, CIA, NSC, et cetera, in terms of an inverse relationship to their ability to do the job, to their proven record, what their resume actually looks like, and whether or not they get hired. And that's the way Washington works. And one of the things I want to key on that Danny talks about, and throughout his talk just now, he said, so far there is going to come a day, how much longer? And in what he's referring to, and this is something I have shared the same fears as him for more than a decade now, is that there is going to be repercussions to these wars. We already deal with the repercussions. We already deal with the casualties, the financial costs, the opportunity costs of these wars, which you all are so familiar with probably, and then as well too the moral cost for what we've done to all the people overseas, the millions of people that we've killed and maimed, the tens of millions we've made homeless. At some point, someone is going to have their vengeance against us, and that's a reality. The only reason that it is nothing but sheer luck, I believe, that hasn't been in the last 20 years. And the more we continue to stomp across the world, killing people, the more likely that vengeance is to be. You know, and the other thing too, I will say about this, I do disagree with Danny on one thing he said. He assigned good intentions to many of the people in these positions, in these war-making positions. And I don't ascribe to that. You know, these are men and women who have consistently lied for decades now, no matter which administration it is. You know, the Washington Post, a year ago last month, it'll be that the Washington Post published the Afghan papers, which demonstrates systematic, you know, lying as a matter of routine and lying as a matter of policy by the US government in all forms about the Afghan war. Of course, the Libyan war was built on lies. What we were doing in Syria, you got the incoming president of the United States, who, a slip of the tongue, made it known that, well, we know that our allies, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis, the Turks, we know that they're, you know, supporting the Islamic State and Al Qaeda in Syria. You know, I mean, so you have this type of this malfeasance that is prevalent. And again, I think the work that Danny has done, a book like this, I think will go a long way to helping people regain some trust that there may be some people out there who know what they're doing and who could do a good job. And then, of course, the work of what you all do here with the Committee for the Republic is another avenue. So, you know, I just want to thank you again, John, for having me on. And yeah, I look forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Oh, good. Thanks, Matt. Danny Sjursen, you have a very interesting background. You were like Danny Davis in the Army. You were you were going places. You taught at West Point. You had all the credentials, and yet you spoke out against the endless wars. Tell us about your background and what your relationship with Danny and Matt is, and how much you guys have in common.
Well, thanks for having me, and you know, it's really an honor to be with this group, and of course with Danny and Matt. Frankly, I'm sort of the young guy in the group, the too late comer to too little descent, but jumped in eventually. So, you know, Danny and Matt kind of started out as inspirations, then colleagues, and now friends, really, which is kind of the greatest honor of all in the whole thing. You know, you mentioned I was, you know, West Point grad. I was in Iraq and Afghanistan, both surges, which I'll talk about in a sec, really framed the way I view all of this. Bipartisan surges, right? A little bit of both, a little red surge, a little blue surge in Iraq and Afghanistan. And, you know, on paper, I was fine. You know, I was thought of highly. It took me too long to speak out, but the gap between what we were being asked to do and what was actually happening, and how far that was off the rails from our Constitution, really jumped out at me. And so sometime after teaching at West Point, I was full-throated, sort of writing and speaking. It's amazing how long before the Army noticed. Probably I wasn't writing well enough, but when they did, they were less than pleased, because as Danny knows, and as Matt knows, the thing that will get them angry, many of the, you know, the higher level figures, is when you embarrass them, right? When you say something that makes them uncomfortable. You can do anything. Incompetence, get soldiers killed. A lot of times that will be forgiven if you say the right things. I think what I want to say is, first of all, Danny's book is so valuable because, well, I got a really early read of it. I was honored. I think I was one of the first people to take a look at it. I was impressed right away. It does something I'm not very good at. I think many of us who are critics are not very good at, which is it does the hard work of laying out what now. And that's hugely valuable, right? And I agree with the vast majority of it, which is interesting because Danny and I aren't necessarily of the same political inflection, whatever degree we have that. And it shows that these are national issues, right? National interest issues, not red team, blue team issues. You know, the personal side, sir, you had asked me to mention a little bit. And, you know, I don't want to speak for Danny and Matt, but I want to say that none of the three of us, I don't think, would change a thing, except maybe yelling louder and yelling sooner. But there are personal costs and tribulations. There are different things that make us do what we do, you know, and it's not just self-righteousness. That might be a small part. The reality is that my journey to saying something was tied to what I think is happening right now, a real litmus test for who's anti-war or anti-hyper-interventionism, anti-executive accumulation of war powers. And that litmus test is how we're going to handle the Biden incoming squad. And this is not a political partisan statement. It's really a national one. My second surge was to Afghanistan right after, not too long after Matt and Danny, right? So I was there in 2011 and 12. I had been on the Obama ship after Iraq, on it, naive and all. He was the salvation. I never want to do this again. This was a nightmare. I'm against all of this. Big supporter. And then I was sent to arguably an equally or more absurd and definitely more hopeless surge, as if the first one wasn't enough, in Afghanistan. We know that, somewhat 1,300 American soldiers died there. Countless Afghans we don't bother really counting. That was a Democrat surge. That was a polite Obama surge. First, I was really, really angry when I got back in 2012. And I probably still haven't really forgiven the duopoly, right? Forgiven the establishment of either party for that fact. But I'll tell you, it was very instructive. Now I'm more tactical about it. I'm strategic. I learned a lesson. And the lesson I learned is where salvation does not come from, right? It's not necessarily going to come from just the top, from these military-industrial complex linked folks. The military-industrial complex is too big and too abstract of a word. And my theory is because there's a hyphen, right? No one can handle a hyphen. So, I've tried to personalize it in some of my work, taking a look at, I did a reunion party piece on the folks that were in Afghanistan around the same time as Danny and myself. And where are they now? Well, it's no surprise. They're in the defense industry, the consulting wing of that industry, or the think tanks funded by that same industry. But that links to Congress, right? And that links to war powers. You mentioned the blob earlier. Well, there's a heck of a blob coming into Washington right now on this transition team. Of course, the film The Blob was about anti-communism, the Red Scare. Of course, I think what's instructive about this blob running the foreign policy establishment is they expose that even at that time, even in the anti-communist time, even in the Red Scare time, the real enemy was always us, right? It was always our unbalanced constitutional framework. It was always this hyper-interventionist elite that's tied to the, the defense industry. So my big fear, and I think the litmus test going forward for our vague movement, right, for the people who care about this country, this republic, is where are you going to fall on things like Afghan troop withdrawal? Where are you going to fall on the Biden squad? Are you going to be a critic when these sort of status quo squads come in? A who's who list, right, of company men, of people who've been involved in this establishment. So the last thing I'll say is the reason I think this is so important is when my sort of mental health fell apart in 2013 in grad school, on my way to teach at West Point, look at amazing on paper. I think part of it, it wasn't just like nightmares and all the standard PTSD talk. It was the knowledge, the fatalism and hopelessness that came in knowing that one of the two parties wasn't going to save me, right? That was a real, there's a clarity in failure. In combat, we say everyone's got a plan until you're punched in the nose. Well, in activism, everyone's got a plan until you're punched in the gut. And I think that, I've been punched in the gut. I think all three of us have by the bipartisan establishment. So last point is we're in a Madisonian moment. I really believe that, this Congress of pushing off a hot potato, responsibility evasion, constitution twisting and violation as a matter of course, that's all a formula for forever war. And it was Madison, I don't need to tell anyone in this group, who said that of all the enemies to public liberty, right? War is the worst because it's got all the others in it. And I think it's important that we talk about a systemic rebalance. I learned that from Obama and Biden when they told me that individuals, discrete parties aren't going to save us. And so while I don't fetishize the military like we did last week on Veterans Day, I don't think that that's healthy in a republic. I will say who better to sort of champion a constitutional rebalance than, a vanguard of critical veterans. And if we can lend some voice with our platform, then I'm glad to do it. And super pleased to be here. Always a pleasure to support Danny and Matt. And thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Great, Danny. Yeah, when times return to normal, I'm going to recommend to committee Republic Board that we give the three of you Defender of Liberty awards. You guys had a lot of guts. Aristotle said that courage is the most important virtue because without it, none of the others are possible. And you guys, my hat's off to you. So I wanted to kick it off. We've got some really, we got a number of former speakers on tonight, which I want to call on. I wanted to start off by saying today we got the announcement, Danny, your mentor, Doug McGregor, has been on our board. Doug was nominated by Trump to be ambassador to Germany. And he was recently deployed to the Pentagon last week to start these troop withdrawals. And today the announcement came out. I guess we have, the announcement said we have 7,500 troops and combined in Afghanistan and Iraq. We have 3,000 in Iraq and 4,500 in Afghanistan. So the announcement is to draw down to 2,500 in each state, which is only a 2,500 troop withdrawal out of 7,500. So it's about a third of the troops that are there. Now, obviously, it's not the numbers aren't the story. But why don't you give us, Danny Davis, give us your take on the symbolism of this. How do you read this this move today?
Yeah, it was. You know, I'm glad that it was up, that it happened. I'm glad as opposed to doing nothing and letting it continue to ride. But you know what? I tell you, the reaction to this in Washington, especially among the establishment people, tells you everything you need to know, and just kind of echoes stuff that both Danny Sjursen and Matt Hoh just both said. I mean, they're freaking out about it. Yeah, as you pointed out, the numbers are pretty small. They're not taking that many people out compared to what's there. And yet you would think that the world is coming to an end, that that American national security is just going to fall apart because these handful of troops come home. I mean, it was, you saw Rubio, and especially Mitch McConnell just almost went crazy, talking about how bad it was. And I mean, just laying all these things out, like everything seems to be, it's 1938 again. Everything's a Munich agreement kind of thing, that like Hitler's going to come rolling across. Nothing of that is the truth. Absolutely none of that. Those troops right now, there's this impression that they're somehow keeping us safe right now. And the goodness, if we take them out, we're not going to be safe. No, they're not. They're not doing hardly anything. In fact, they're doing nothing of strategic value for the United States. We keep ourselves safe with our very potent and effective intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance strike capability, ISR strike as it's called. And we can take out any direct threat that's a genuine threat to America anywhere in the world. And we demonstrated it on numerous occasions. We don't need one soldier deployed in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Africa, anywhere you want to mention. They all should come home, and our strength, our national security will be strengthened, not decreased by it. But this whole war racket thing that Danny was talking about a second ago is kind of on display here, because they are almost digging in their fingernails because they're terrified of losing a combat operation. But we need to get rid of them all. So that's really my observation of it.
Right. So if Trump had taken it down to zero in either country, it would have been harder for Biden to send the troops back. But leaving it at 2,500 in each place gives him the benefit to.
Yeah, because he keeps the infrastructure in place, and so it's really easy to just send more over there because there's already all the infrastructure. If you get rid of all that stuff, it becomes much harder to do. So I really wish he had taken it to zero.
Right. Well, good. We have tonight, I see we've got Molly McCartney on our board. Molly wrote America's War Machine. I see we have David Vine, who did Base Nation, which we had a Salon on, and David's got a new book out I just got, and looking forward to reading. I see John Mueller from Ohio, and Cato is on, who we had a great Salon with him, and Ivan Eland on our board. So why don't you guys jump in and or Molly and ask our speaker a question. I see William Smith is also on. We had a great Salon with William. 2 months ago.
I was on mute, John. Yes, I do have a question. This is Molly McCartney. Someone mentioned in their remarks, I think it was the last speaker, that the expression military industrial complex is very hard for people to sort of get their head around. That's one of the reasons that the book that my husband started and I finished is titled America's War Machine. That's a much easier graphic way to describe the problem. So I just wanted to mention that. And then my question is, what is the next step, particularly with the Biden people coming to town? What is the next step to move forward on this issue? And I'd like to hear from all three of the people who spoke to see specifically one or two things that you think you could do or that could be done to advance us on this effort to stop these wars.
Well, I'll just jump out real quick. I mean, the most important thing is for, Americans to make their voices heard, that they're not just a number on a poll, but that, no, seriously, I'm tired of all this stuff. Y'all do something different. Quit sending our sons and daughters over there to get their arms and legs blown off or to get traumatic brain injuries for no gain to our country. It's time to stop that. Keep us safe, but it's time to do that. So, it's going to take some courage, frankly. John, you hit it square on the head. And if the people that Biden brings on don't have the courage to buck the system and to do what makes sense, I don't have a lot of hope that it's going to get fixed. I just really hope that that's not the case. In fact, at least they're coming in, gives me some hope that maybe they'll do something different.
Good.
I think that, for me, it's we've got to educate people on how this affects their lives. So many Americans are insulated from these wars. Even if you add in the number of suicides into the number of killed in action and include the number of private contractors killed in these wars, you're approaching 25,000 dead from these wars. That's 25,000 families that have been wrecked forever. But that's a very small number in a 330 million person country. People can go their whole lives and never meet anybody who have been in these wars, let alone affected this way. So how do we teach people? How do we educate people? How do we inform people how these wars affect their lives? How these wars are tied into the larger financial system? How these wars are tied into fossil fuel use? How these wars are tied into the entertainment and news media communities? The same banks that own 90% of the S&P 500 are the same banks that own weapons manufacturers, that own the news media, that own the Hollywood studios, that own the fossil fuel companies, et cetera. So there is a larger connection to this that you can then address in the sense of, well, this is all tied into financialization. This is all tied into keeping wages low, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea, though, is how do you make it relevant to the person in their community? How do you show that the opportunity cost of these wars? That, look, we've spent almost according to Brown University, we've spent almost $1 trillion on these wars just in debt and interest payments alone. So in the sense of the priorities that we are assigning to these wars with our pocketbooks, while we are then saying we cannot do A, B, and C. And then another point, that as Danny Sjursen brings up all the time, I think he's the one who first pointed this out to me. With the exception of World War I, World War II, and the Civil War, COVID has killed far more people than the rest of our wars combined. So again, communicating to people that this massive federal government that we have, it's not really protecting us. And where is all that money going to? Where is all those resources going to? Where are all those priorities going to? So again, I think it goes back to trying to explain to people how these wars actually affect their individual lives and how it affects their communities.
I'll just add that I think the greatest challenge is the one that Matt is raising, which is how do you shake people of apathy and distraction and genuine busyness, right? And insecurity, whether it's economic or otherwise. I do think that while I don't suspect the two-party system is going anywhere I live in the world as it is. I think that there are real alliances that need to be made. And I think that when we look at the war state, when we look at the corruption that's inherent in it, when we look at the constitutional imbalance, all the things that everyone in this, all the speakers are describing should be amenable to conservatives and liberals alike, real ones, right? Real people who believe in the Republic and the Constitution, regardless of their flavor. There should be a lot of alliance between progressive and libertarian, between conservative and liberal, whatever, however you define that. And until we're big enough, right, to reject our cultural, tribal affiliations with some of these groups and say corruption is wrong, even if Trump says it. Corruption is wrong, even if someone we don't like is the one pointing it out. Corruption and this kind of war state, imperialism that essentially affects every aspect of our lives, our civil liberties, which really matter to a lot of folks, our pocketbooks and bottom lines, which really matter to a lot of other folks, right? And there's a lot of overlap. So I do really think that we have to work hard to work across transpartisan sort of, across ideologies, across different groups. If we get war right, we can get the rest right. We can work out the details. If we get war wrong, as we have for so long, then I'll tell you, I really don't believe that much else is going to fall in line. And, that's what I said about a litmus test. I don't even like that word. I don't really like purity tests, but I do think there are certain times where you really have to come down on one end of an issue or another. And we've got to just step outside of that. We got to get out of the world where if I go to a libertarian anti-war event, I get a ton of attacks for that from people who are anti-war, but they're progressive anti-war. I just think we have to sort of reject that, be bigger than Biden, be bigger than Trump, be bigger than these parties. That may sound pie in the sky, but it's vital. If it doesn't happen, this is going to continue.
John?
Great. Thank you, Danny.
John, could I make an observation? Am I on mute?
Yes. Bruce, fine.
Yes,
Yeah.
just a couple of things. I think that we've had a wonderful presentation. I think I just add, I think the first casualty of the perpetual wars, the Constitution itself. It's off of life support. It's not just the flouting of the declare war clause has led to lawlessness as becoming the norm. Congress is an inkblot. They give away all of the power, domestic, foreign affairs, waivers. The president runs our foreign trade policy and investment by decree. He steals money from FEMA to pay unemployment, steals money from military construction to build a wall. He claims, like his predecessors, he can kill anybody he wants if they claim it's an imminent danger and an enemy combatant. We don't even have a constitution anymore. It's flouted so much that it's taken as a norm. He doesn't comply with subpoenas. It's all secret up there. That's just an observation. We already have lost the Constitution. The second thing is that dealing with reality, and I'm up there at Congress all the time, they don't want the power, and it's not conservatives and liberals. Both sides get angry when they have to make a decision, and they're not embarrassed to say, we want to give the power away, because it'll create a primary opponent if we vote on anything. And that's the character, and most of them are totally ignorant of the Constitution. We recently had somebody elected a senator from Alabama who said we have three branches of government, the House, the Senate, and the executive, and that we fought World War II to shout the communists out of France. And then that's on the conservative side. The liberals think they're for chambers of government. But the current members, I believe, are so corrupted by the system, which is built on money and raising funds for parties to get on committee assignments, that if you're going to deal with reality, you have to abandon the current crop. They're worthless. Congress will not do anything. Congress itself, if they had the guts, they really were worried about the president pulling out troops, could just mandate, hey, we'll vote and we'll insist troops go in, but Congress won't want to do that. They'll complain that the president pulls troops out, but they won't do anything to go on record otherwise. I prepared something called the Constitution Restoration Project. I'm hoping that Jamie Raskin and Thomas Massey will hold hearings during the lame duck session. It's about 62 pages, rules, resolutions, statutes to regain congressional power. But it's not just the power, you have to have the political will to exercise it. And without recruiting new people who enter into politics, without this corruption of this current system, you're never going to be able to do anything with the current crowd. I can tell you because I'm up there all the time and they just won't respond. Nancy says we can't do it. Mitch McConnell says we can't do it. We just throw up our hands. We don't want to vote. And they're not embarrassed about it.
Right. We're going to be having
John,
a number of salons on that. Who is speaking?
John, Bob Randolph here.
Oh, hey, Bob.
I have a
Welcome.
question. Hey, John. Thank you. And thank you, Danny and Matt and Daniel, for your really articulate and excellent presentation on the way forward. And I want to say that I agree with you that we should have been out of Iraq. We should have been out of Afghanistan. And certainly we should have been out, we should be out of the war that we didn't even know we were fighting in Syria. What worries me is that the president has always been a day late and a dollar short on realizing and actualizing his campaign promises, particularly this one, is moving in a way that is awkward, to say the best, and appears to be thoughtless, to say the least, and is going to screw everything up and leave a mess that for Biden that he's going to take hold of, and probably screw it up even more with the squad, Matthew, that you say is coming to town. So what does this look like? What does the way that we're going about this look like to you, the three of you?
Well, I mean,
And I'll start.
It's hard for me to disagree with what you're saying there. I mean, that is part of my real concern. And really to kind of finish the original question that was asked a minute ago about what you can do, I strongly second what Bruce just said about, maybe one of the only ways is we got to go out and recruit and get people to run for Congress that can go in there, that actually have some courage, or at least have some intelligence and wisdom, that can go out there and start making a difference when they hit the ground. It may be too little too late, I don't know, but I mean, we got to at least try, because the alternative, as Bruce also said, is to just let Nancy and Mitch just run fire.
What about Daniel? What do you think about this?
Well,
What is going to be the outcome if Trump screws this up? I mean, we've got rockets being fired into the green zone now.
frankly, I mean, I'll take a fairly provocative position on it. If there weren't any Americans in the green zone, it's an open question, and I think I know the answer as to the extent to which, it would be a concern or a target, or whether it should be there in the first place. I agree that the problem with Trump, among many problems, is that he's hasty, he's inconsistent, he doesn't follow through for years, and then suddenly it's like he gets the inkling or the gut feeling, or he wants to show somebody who's boss, right? Or he's going to be vindictive. All these different character flaws that manifest in, like, he'll do something, but it's out of nowhere. I generally will support anything that starts pulling troops out of any of these places. I do think that there's not much to mess up in Afghanistan, in the sense that the Taliban is in the strongest position that it has been since really the start of the war. And we already lost. It's a zombie war. It's a zombie war. It's a dead man walking. It's a dead war walking, and nobody seems to want to admit it. Certainly, I would have liked to have seen President Trump follow through on this earlier, removing the infrastructure, doing it in, I'm not one of those people who likes the phrase leave responsibly. I do have an inclination towards we marched in, we could march out Ron Paul style. I think sometimes when something is such a disaster that there's a Band-Aid aspect to it, one move right off, Seinfeld style. That being said, I would have preferred that obviously Trump followed through on this earlier, okay, tempered the troop levels down and gotten us out of there, because what's going to happen now is you see this panic. And I think the real story of what's happening with Trump and the troop withdrawals is the media response, the congressional response. Because it gives them ammunition to say that it's hasty, Of course, hasty really stretches the language after 19 years. But it's a reasonable critique. I mean, it is a reasonable critique when you rush it out as a lame duck who has not yet conceded. You give ammunition to the Mitch McConnells and the Nancy Pelosi's of the world. When you get them to agree, when you give them that kind of sort of bipartisan ammunition, I think you do set up long-term failure. So I support full withdrawal along with the 73% of other veterans of that war who do and have been ignored. But at the same time, I do think that by being so inconsistent, he's opening himself up to Biden saying, well, I have to undo everything Trump did, just like Trump undid everything Obama did. And it's just a cycle.
Yeah,
John, would you like to ask your question now?
John, can you hear me? John Kaiser.
John Henry, can you hear John Kaiser?
We can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you. Go, John.
What's missing here and what's being groped for, so to speak, is an action plan. And it would seem to me the only way an action plan can really make a difference is through the Congress, despite all of the limp dicks that are in the Congress. I would like to think that there are Matts and Dannys from the military in every state in the Union. And unless you mobilize entities, basically pressure groups from within, people from within the military who can speak authentically and powerfully about how messed up things are, and to lobby their congressmen and senators state by state and have a campaign, a military political campaign to change the way we think about our role in the world. Because it's not going to just happen for all the reasons these gentlemen have said. It's got to be an organized effort, and it presumably has to encompass all the major states. Politically, you can sort of maybe figure out, some sort of a formula that would be optimal. But I don't see it unless you mobilize the veterans who can articulate and say convincingly the kind of things that we've heard today. I don't see any hope for change.
Well, and boy, who could disagree with that? I mean, I think Danny and Matt and I have both talked about how great that would be a lot of time. But, this illustrates the biggest problem is that, you've got all these people in the defense think tanks and all these other kinds of things that are making money on this stuff. There's a lot of money in that. So people are motivated because they have cash behind it, but there's no cash to let's do it right. So even though there's large numbers of us out there, there's no money for us to mobilize to do anything because we can't fund it. And, you can't self-fund this kind of thing. And I've actually tried a few times to try to bring something up, and so far I just hadn't found anybody with money that's willing to do it.
Richest guys in the country. So John Henry, step up, put some seed money into this fucking thing and start getting the money together. You got money. There's a lot of money in this county. Start right here at home. What are you whining about? We got tons of money. Go do something with it.
Can I just jump in real quick? I do think this is important. Danny and Matt are pretty eloquent, pretty educated, pretty experienced, decent looking, right? They should be congressmen. Anybody call you guys from the DNC or the RNC? That's my point. I think that one of the problems is that if you look at the what I call the quizzling, collaborating congressmen on the Hill, and I really focused on the Democrats because I think it's important to attack the left from the left and the right from the right sometimes. If you look at who is being chosen, even among the veteran community, for the Democrats, it's to burnish their tough guy credentials. Look at who they pick. There's obviously a massive vetting process, right? Either that or there's some sort of lobotomy because they're not reaching out to certain types of people. And I think that we have to, I don't know how this really works. I mean, there are people more smart on this than me at the grassroots, but at the local level, we have to be pressuring our party apparatus, right? Whatever that is, to go get the voices who are willing to be courageous, who are willing to be outspoken, because oftentimes, like Danny mentioned, within the military, the outspoken ones, the truth tellers, they kind of don't even get asked. It's the same reason a lot of us don't get asked to go on CNN. So I do think that if we're going to get voices like ours and better than ours to be recruited, then we're going to have to sort of demand that, because the party apparatus is, right, left to their own devices, are going to pick Jason Crow and Tom Cotton every time. And it's a bipartisan enterprise of really collaborating congressmen who go up to the Hill and then say, I know that I was in that war with you. I know that 70-something% of you, my fellow brothers and sisters in arms, are against this war, but I'm going to go up there and I'm going to follow the orders of Nancy. And I'll tell you, that's really disturbing. And I don't know, maybe you guys did get a call. I didn't, you know.
Nope.
How many of you are familiar with Ralph Peters' commentaries on this? He's Army Intel. He's considered a bit of a renegade. He's a Boyd. He's an Army version of Boyd.
Yeah, I know him. He used to write for the New York Post, I believe, or at least get syndicated there. My father was a big fan. It's like the one thing we ever agreed on sometimes.
You know, and the way we're fighting wars has only one purpose: be the machine, and that the way we're conducting the wars are totally opposite to what needs to be done, which is smaller, fewer, agile. Get rid of all these big camps and Coca-Cola machines and massage parlors and all the comforts that we bring with us into these. I mean, it's he's kind of persona non grata in the establishment, but he's a huge reservoir of knowledge. In fact, John Henry, I just bought a book for you called The Firing Line, and it's by Peters, and it's his comments and reflections on how badly we have conducted our wars, I guess probably since World War II, maybe Korea, I don't know. But he would be an excellent strategist, I think, in thinking about how to attack the problem.
John, Todd has something to say, and I know you can't see him, so I'm just going to ask you to listen, all right?
Yeah, using Ralph Peters as an introductory point. As John knows, I've written, correspond with the Committee for the Republic a lot, et cetera. They all know my views. People are on that email list if they bother reading it. But let me tell you, Ralph Peters is as close as we have to a real fascist. And I use that term by Mussolini's definition, somebody who loves war, who believes in total war, and believes in take no quarters. Ralph Peters advocated, writing for the Jewish Institute for National Security a number of years ago, and I've written about this, of how we may have to begin killing journalists, executing journalists, because they weaken our will. That's the same argument being made by the Reichswehr back in the 1930s and 40s, and a tradition that goes back a long ways, which goes to the suppression, why sedition is always been deemed something that needed to be exercised during wartime, so that our will isn't weakened. And again, that's the basis of fascist military theory. So Ralph Peters, I'm going to respectfully say, we need to read him to understand and to take him as a negative indicator of what we should be doing, I would argue. But on that note, with all respect to Daniel and his book, and looking at his national interest article, and I'll try not to make this too long, but a few weeks ago. But Daniel, with all respect, and as much as I agree and respect with you and respects you, one of the paragraphs in it, in your national interest article was, that is why the best deterrence our country can have is to maintain an armed forces capable of invincible national defense, comma, able to repulse any attack and exact such a terrible price on any foe who dares attack us that none will likely ever try. And in the unexpected case some do try, comma, we will crush them and win. And I would say that's exactly the wrong strategy we need. But it's in line with Thomas Schilling's argument way back in the 60s, 50s, and up to the present day, because that's what Trump is operating under and our Democrats are operating under, the idea of diplomacy of violence, having such an overwhelming, disproportionate power over the world that we can get our way just by menacing the world, which is a criminal code definition of how a criminal uses menacing to get their way. And that's what our foreign policy has been ever since the end of World War II, in all honesty. And Schelling put that into words in the 1960s. And so I would suggest that having, and Matt made a very good argument, people are going to look for vengeance. We can get by with this so long. The Germans got by with this in Europe for quite a few years until rebellion, what they called terrorists in the form of guerrilla warfare, etc. And then, of course, the Allies overwhelmed them and overthrew them and put Germany back in the state that had been a couple hundred years before. Hitler did more damage to Germany than the Jews could ever have done had they wanted to, which of course they didn't. But that's the the paradox of total war. There's a boomerang effect, as Hannah Arendt talked about. I would suggest people look at a book called Between War and Politics, which is about Hannah Arendt's theory of foreign policy, which I would argue makes more sense than neoconservatism, neorealism, constructive realism, all these things that start off from the point that the United States must dominate the world. Because we cannot do it, number one. China is proving it, and they're going to rebel, as they're doing, by going back, as we saw at the beginning of the global war on terror. They recognized that they and Russia were next in line, when we had the means to do it, to overthrow them. And so that's what we're dealing with today. They've only taken notice that we're coming after them eventually. And so they better begin arming themselves. And so that's what we're dealing with, this so-called threat today from China and Russia, is that they're really merely resisting what we made clear in our national security strategy, that no, we rule the world. We have total military dominance. So
John, do you mind if I reply to that?
So, but that's my point. Matt, you come up with some very good points, but I suggest we need to begin looking at this subject deeper. And as people who read the Committee for the Republic email list knows, I become a harsh critic of conservatism that insists upon the same train of thought that we've had for decades. And I'm a harsh critic of neoliberalism and the Democrats, because this present administration is bringing in all the war hawks. So anyway, that's.
Yeah, so yeah, I appreciate it. And maybe I didn't do a very good job in how I presented this stuff, and that's on me if I did. But I can assure you that's definitely not what I intended when I wrote that, because I'm with you on that. I'm like, no, I don't want to be using our military to dominate on anybody. What I do want to have, and maybe we'll still disagree, is that I want us to have a national defense capability, so that if China or Russia or some other country decides that they want to unjustly just attack us because they don't like us, that they can't do it and they're deterred from trying. But I am 100% in agreement with you that we should stop using our military to try to dominate anyone unless they're attacking us. I mean, we should have a national defense, and I think that's a big distinction. So if I didn't make that clear, I just wanted to do it now.
If I could make one final point. Recently, the Committee for the Republic also had a very good meeting, and they talked about the imperialist personality, which of course we see every day in both parties. But they also talked about culture. But in my opinion, and no disrespect to anybody, but it degenerated in a way when it suddenly became more what cultural Marxism is usually described as, coming from the universities, Hollywood. And instead of looking at what is a war culture, because war is a phenomena that also affects people's consciousness. So for 20 years, the American people have been in this feeling that we're surrounded by enemies, and that affects people's consciousness, a broader term than psychology. So that we see it as completely normal that Trump, McCain, all these people come in and say, we got to spend over $1 trillion for new modernization, nuclear weapons, for example, which we're in the process of doing, with no dissent to that. So the culture that we're really at risk of, and the same one that the Germans were at risk of in the 20s and 30s, which came out of World War I, was a war culture. And that is a culture, and the squad, we need to distinguish between squads. AOC, Ilhan Omar, the representative from Michigan, who opposed the Israelis' domination of the Palestinians, they need to be distinguished from Pelosi and all these other Democrats coming into power now who believe in military domination of the world. So with that, I'll stop and say no more.
Hey, just a second, John. We can't hear your audio. You may have to rejoin. Close your window and rejoin, because it's not related to mute.
Hey, John, I had one comment. I sort of second that, because I think, we on the right, which I'm most familiar with, we have this school that says, well, let's have restrained foreign policy, but I'm going to build up the military, such Pat Buchanan in the old days, Trump now. And to me, the reason that we went askew and we don't follow the Constitution anymore is we, excuse me, and Bruce was alluding to this earlier, is that the incentives have changed. We got a big standing army. We've got military industrial complex after World War II, and that's when we got perpetual war. So we have to, how do we unwind these incentives? I say the first one, I think that Empire Salon's right on target by doing something on the non-delegation doctrine so that Congress can't give away all its power. The second thing is, I think we can't rely on either party to make good decisions. Like after 9/11, instead of being responsible, taking retaliation or whatever, and not doing a nation building thing in Afghanistan, well, we failed at that. Then we took it even a further step and go into some unrelated country, had nothing to do with 9/11. That's the Republican problem. Then Obama came in, he looked at all that mess, and of course, Bush should have looked at the mess that the British and the Soviets, the British 3 times and the Soviets once had in Afghanistan. But America's going to be different because we're great, right? So Bush didn't look at any of that. Well, Obama comes in, looks at the mess in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then he goes into Libya. So you can't count on the politicians. So what you have to do is change the incentives, the non-delegation doctrine. And I think you have to go to sequestration to cut the defense budget along with anything else. That way they can't log roll, trade my program for your program. And there's other reforms that you can do to change the incentives back, but otherwise we're not going to get anywhere. We can't have a huge military and expect them not to use it because it's just too tempting.
Can I add on that a little bit? Todd has been bringing up ancient literature. Let me bring up a case of Bernard Brody's book written in the late 70s about in the wake of Vietnam, War and Politics. And when you're, Danny, when you're giving a discussion of your book, what it sounded like is right out of Brody. Brody at that time was talking about probably the stupidest war ever, which was World War I. And the question of why couldn't they get out? And he says the same thing you do, basically, that the optimists dominate and the pessimists or clash realists basically, get sidelined. That happened repeatedly, despite perpetual disaster in that war of cosmic proportions. And his conclusion is the only way to avoid that is people can't get into wars. In other words, the way to keep people out of getting into trouble is to get rid of the tools for doing so. The logic of that is not what you say. Basically, we should have a zillion people in the military, but we shouldn't have a military at all. There would be some risk. I don't think either Xi or Putin is likely to turn out to be another Hitler, but you'd have to think about that a little bit. But it's just basically the only way to get rid of this military thing you talk about, this optimism, the think tank thing, is to get rid of the military. Now, you don't want to buy that argument, obviously, but I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, the problem with that, there's two real problems. I might can agree that there is some validity to the thought, because if you don't have this thing that can be used at will, it's a lot easier not to use it. But I think politically, I don't think there's even a fraction of the country that would agree to follow that, because it would make you vulnerable. And you can look and see, for example, in 1939, when the Wehrmacht went into Poland, their military was old. They had not kept it modernized, whatever. And so they were basically helpless to a bad guy like a Hitler, who could go in there because he was correct and he could just sweep in there, him along with Russia on the other side. And if we got to a point where we didn't have a military, or it wasn't strong enough to defend us, then it might.
And you have to argue that there's another Hitler coming up. Do you think anybody's another Hitler? Hitlers are very rare.
Well, I mean, our geography probably prohibits that, right. And I would even say that the nuclear age, we've kind of forgotten about what that actually has done. And I think the chances of large field armies, I think, is just not going to happen. There's no chance that, for example, that Russia is going to come sweeping across Europe in the modern era, because France has their own nuclear weapons. Britain has them. There's no way they're going to allow Russia to just swoop in there without using their weapons, and Russia knows that, so they're never going to try. And so I don't think we actually need all these big standing armies, but right now people can't get to that mentality to do that, because they're so sensitive to being afraid by the people who would lose financially from that, like the Raytheons and all that kind of stuff. And so you keep having this, it keeps coming back, and I don't know how you get around that.
Yeah, well, I agree. It's hard to get around, but the issue is we didn't have an army. We couldn't be in Iraq. We couldn't be in Afghanistan. We could have been in Vietnam. The tools were there to get into it. But you seem to be optimistic about being able to change the system. It seems to me.
I'm hopeful, because if I'm not optimistic, that if we don't at least try, then I'm going to just fall into deep depression. So I've got to try what I can.
Yeah, well, I think, you can sequestration where you cut every budget account by X%. And you say, look, we're running up a huge debt because of the COVID epidemic, because of all the 2008 financial crisis, and the debt is staggering now. Trump just added $7 trillion to the deficit. He's king of all champions about that. And I think, if you tell the country, we're wallowing in debt, and the only real way, this is an economist decision trick to prevent log rolling. Say, congressmen will trade, within the defense budget and across the whole government. I'll vote for your program if you vote for mine. If you have a set budget, if you just take a meat axe, and it's not a scalpel, but it's a meat axe, and you start saying, listen, everybody's got to sacrifice because we have to cut the budget. I mean, sequestration.
I think you're onto something there, and here's why. I think you're onto something there. There could be, because when I say that we should have an invincible national defense, I mean that no one can launch an unprovoked attack against us and be able to survive it without being gouged. That does not mean that we need to have an $800 billion military funded. To the contrary, I think we could have that at a far, far lower level and still be completely dependent, but it would limit us from having these wars of choice every time we feel like throwing some troops out there, because you wouldn't have money for that. And so I think that there's something to that.
And your idea of cutting ground forces is what they need to do. Air and sea, we're, for our geography, one of the most secure great powers in history. So what we're really talking about here is defending the empire, defending other countries, yes, or going on the offensive. We're not talking about our security. We need to build a military that's smaller. And I agree with you. We still have to have some striking power on the air and the sea, but I think reducing ground forces is one way to do it.
If I could just jump in really quick, it's funny how this all sort of works out when you look at just one anecdote, but it's a pretty instructive one with the nuclear arsenal and the nuclear modernization, right? Kicked off, ultimate bipartisan thing, kicked off by Obama, increased, and extended by Trump. I mean, China has shown us, right? I don't look to China as much of a model, but strategically sometimes they play a better hand, and they've proven that with 300, 400, 500, 600 nuclear weapons. I'd like to see 0, but I also live in the world as it is. They've proven that they can make themselves unattackable to a certain extent. They have a small number, they move them around and stuff and make sure that they can hit back. And so instead of thousands of nuclear weapons, I mean, if you just cut that, if you just said, look, we can bring that down to this level and maintain the same ability, we won't even say we won't do a first strike, let alone go to that level. But I think that's just one example of, the overkill in our budget. And hey, look, the Army is going to learn what it wants to learn to protect its budgets, and so will the other services. So they'll take Nagorno-Karabakh, which none of them heard of, except for the Command and General Staff College Caucasus scenario that we all did. And what are they going to say? No, don't say tanks are going obsolete, right? Which I'm not saying that's necessarily what the lesson of Nagorno-Karabakh is, but the lady doth protest too much in the armor branch and in the Army. And so they'll look at any situation and say, we need more tanks, right? Even when, at some point Congress gives them more than they even want. So I think that the nuke arsenal and China is just a great example of how far the overkill goes. And so the idea of a set budget can help.
And I think even more to your point, in terms of what people are afraid of and why they don't actually do the numbers and the math, is that, look, so many people these days, especially repeated, that they gave all these warnings about Iran and they could do all this big damage. And I'm like, okay, their defense budget is $11 billion a year or something to that effect. That's like like a 20th of ours or something like that. How can we be afraid of a little country that can barely even, in fact, they can't project any real power beyond their own borders, other than just nefarious, little things that can actually be balanced out by their own neighbors in the country? Why do I need to be so afraid that we're risking going to war against this little tiny power that can't do anything to us? And the truth is they can't, and they can be easily deterred without us even messing with it. That would imply that we would have to not want to destroy them and just wipe them off the face of the earth like some frankly want to do. But in terms of our security, our just standard military will deter them, and we don't have to worry about that at all because they can't do it.
Yes, and when China spends only about a third of what we do. And the other question is, why are we in East Asia? They're not in Latin America with their military. So I think, we also need to look at some mirror imaging things, like we don't see ourselves in the mirror. We're everywhere in the world, and China's maybe everywhere commercially, but they're certainly not everywhere militarily.
I don't know if you heard, they have one military base in Africa, in Djibouti. So
it's a small one.
Listen, they're coming for your kids straight through the Caribbean. That's how it starts. Everyone knows it starts in the Horn of Africa. Everyone knows this. Just keep an eye out, kids.
I think the danger with China, though, is that are we creating a China that we want? In the sense that for how many years now, 25 years at least or so, it's starting in the Clinton administration, you start to see when Clinton sends the aircraft carriers to the East China Sea. I mean, we are creating our own future here. We are creating our own reality in the sense that we have seen China increase their defense spending. We have, you talk to a guy like Larry Wilkerson about this, and he can explain to you how China in the last 25 years has they've got their own version of a military industrial complex that is blossoming and taking control, as well as too, they are upgrading some of their nuclear weapons, and they have put in an advanced warning system that they didn't have before because of our rhetoric, because of our actions, because we keep sending not just our carriers there, but our missile boats, our Tridents, are within 15 minutes of their capital. The flight time for their missiles, and so that's something that I think we have to really, push back on and explain to people is that, look, we are creating these realities. There are so much of this world that we are faced with is because of our actions. Take these terror groups that are all through Africa, right? Before AFRICOM was stood up in 2007, 2008, AFRICOM is the U.S. military command for Africa. There were about 25 terror attacks a year in Africa. Now, 10 years after AFRICOM has been stood up and we have a commando presence and a drone presence in 24 nations, maybe, there are more than 2,000 terror attacks every year in Africa. So, I mean, and I know, and Danny Davis, I feel like y'all remember the old Newhart TV show with his neighbor Larry. He'd always come in and be like, this is my brother Daryl, my other brother Daryl. I feel like that would be, particularly on Zoom here because I'm between the two of them, so my brother Danny and my other brother Danny. Right. What Danny Davis, says all the time about Afghanistan. Before we went into Afghanistan in 2001, there was one international terror group in Afghanistan. And now every year the generals go to the Hill and they say there's 20. So we are creating, because of allowing not just the narratives and the myths, but the reality of our presence in these places, and our actions. If I have to read another study that shows that the young men who join these militant groups, these insurgent groups, primarily do so because they've had a family member or a friend who've been killed by U.S. or proxy government forces, I'm going to have an aneurysm. I mean, we keep repeating the same actions, and then the consequences of those are actually what helps sustain, this war, this mania, this madness.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what's happened to my audio,
We lost you.
but I think this is an indication we've run over our time, way over our time, but that is an indication of how, Danny, how compelling you and Matt, Danny have been. on this subject, and we will resume it. But we have to, in the interest of time, we try. This is our normal salons go an hour and a half. This is now going on an hour and a half, but we try to keep the Zoom close to an hour. But I appreciate everybody and attending, and we will be addressing these subjects in great detail beginning next month. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Bravo. Bravo. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Great program.
Thank you.
I agree.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Yes,
John.
John.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for having me.
Good work, John.